Bandwidth for changelog is provided by Fastly. Learn more at fastly.com. We move fast and fix things here at changelog because of Rollbar. Check them out at rollbar.com. And we're hosted on Linode servers. Head to linode.com/changelog.
This episode is sponsored by our friends at Rollbar. How important is it for you to catch errors before your users do? What if you could resolve those errors in minutes and then deploy with confidence? That's exactly what Rollbar enables for software teams. One of the most frustrating things we all deal with is errors. Most teams either A, rely on their users to report errors, or B, use log files and lists of errors to debug problems. That's such a waste of time. Instantly know what's broken and why with Rollbar. Reduce time wasted debugging and automatically capture errors alongside rich diagnostic data to help you defeat impactful errors. You can integrate Rollbar into your existing workflow. It integrates with your source code repository and deployment system to give you deep insights into exactly what changes caused each error. Give Rollbar a try today at no cost to you. No credit card is required. Our listeners get access to the Bootstrap plan with 100,000 events for free for 90 days. To get started, head to rollbar.com/changelog. Hello and welcome to JS Party, a weekly celebration of JavaScript and the web. We have a special episode for you today. KBall and I went to Fluent/Velocity in San Jose last week and had the chance to talk to some amazing people. We bring you 3 of those great conversations today. First, Bryan Douglas, a developer advocate at GitHub, Aimee Knight, who used to be a professional ice skater and now a full stack developer, and Bryan Hughes, a technical evangelist at Microsoft. Enjoy the show.
Hey there, KBall here at Fluent Conf reporting. I'm here with Bryan Douglas, developer advocate at GitHub. Bryan, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well.
Awesome. I saw you speak yesterday, talking a little bit about GraphQL and things like that. Can you tell us about your talk and how it went?
Yeah. So I got the opportunity of doing a lightning talk at Fluent Conf. So we had like a handful of lightning talks, and my talk was focused around exploring GraphQL in your API. And it goes back to, so I work at GitHub now, but prior to GitHub, I worked at a company called Netlify, who is also a sponsor here at Fluent Conf. And I got the opportunity to do some like research and development around getting GraphQL into our API. And my talk kind of covers how I didn't want to actually own the backend to get GraphQL to work. And I got a lot of pushback from our backend teams to adding GraphQL because at the moment, GraphQL is really valuable for front-end developers.
Right.
And so I just talked about my experience and how I got GraphQL working at Netlify and how I use GraphQL at GitHub now.
Yeah, so one of the things you said that was really interesting to me was that an upcoming version of the GitHub API is going to be all GraphQL?
Yeah, so it's actually already out. So version 4 is out. It's public. You can use it. So version 3 is what you would know as the REST API. And then version 4 is the GraphQL API. And the cool thing about it is like version 4 is the last version. With GraphQL, you can make changes to your API without breaking certain things, like outside of like name changes. So we do have some breaking changes coming up in the next few months that we happen to change the names of endpoints. But other than that, like the breaking changes are, you just either add to GraphQL, you don't really need to remove things.
Awesome. So for folks who aren't familiar, can you give us a just quick rundown on what GraphQL is and how it differs from traditional APIs?
Yeah, so GraphQL came out of the Facebook team, Lee Byron and I forget Dan's last name, Dan, and the third person who also escapes me. Lee's probably the most public-facing GraphQL team member. And they came up with spec to interact with the backend that was different from REST. So Graph being graph database, QL being query language. So GraphQL is just another way for your mobile team, your front-end team to interact with the API that doesn't have to be a REST way.
Yeah, one of the things that interests me a lot about it is it's almost flipping your paradigm on your head. So instead of crafting your API around your back-end representation, your models that you are exposing as resources, you're allowing the front end to say, here's the data I want right now, just give it to me. You figure out the rest.
Yeah, and that's the cool thing about it is that as a front-end developer, and I was a long-time front-end developer at Netlify and previous companies, I continued, though I had the capacity to go back and do back-end changes, I continued to have to go to the back-end team and say, hey, this endpoint's not producing the right payload, or I'm missing like emails for this user. Can you add this? And then the process of like waiting and requesting, and like I think of like backend changes like the equivalent of like front end developers and copy changes. Like no one wants to do them, but you're gonna have to like queue those up, and someone, junior developer or whoever, has to like crank through those. And now it's everything's in the payload, and as long as you whitelist it on your GraphQL endpoint, and then you can now just define your schema on the front end or inside if you're doing mobile on your client, and you get what you need, and everybody's happy on both ends.
Nice. Now, in your talk, you talked about introducing GraphQL as a wrapper with the W. And in JS Party, we have a long history with joking about wrap and things like that, because it's a party about JavaScript, and we're all nerds, so we're terrible at wrapping, but we try occasionally.
Okay.
But can you talk about that kind of wrapper concept? Like, how is it that you introduce GraphQL as a wrapper around an existing API?
Yeah, so I had this like long pun, and I noticed I never actually mentioned like hip hop or rap. That was kind of like my ploy in giving the talk, is like, don't address the slides, but talk about wrappers as in the GraphQL. So wrappers, to explain for the listener, is like if you think of like API gateways, like GraphQL gateways instead. So you're just taking your normal REST API and you're wrapping it into a GraphQL schema. So one, it's a third party that doesn't have to break or deprecate anything on the REST side, but you're just exposing GraphQL for any sort of front end consuming. And so I built a wrapper using Apollo's Launchpad to be able to prototype GraphQL on my front end and be able to consume that in like what at the time was a React Native app. And from there, I was able to, one, check the box that I wanted to use GraphQL in this React Native app, and then two, I didn't have to like get complaints from the backend team saying, hey, you're dropping all this code in here for us to support, and you're just going to go do your front end thing and like disappear. So I was able to support my prototype and then go back to the team and say, hey, GraphQL works. Here's the metrics. Everything's the same. And here's all the things we can kind of unlock if we use GraphQL going forward.
So that I understand, what you're essentially doing then is your gateway calls back to your REST API, pulls whatever sets of resources it needs to expose, kind of caches them in some way, and then exposes them via GraphQL?
Yeah, and the caching, like that's something that a lot of people are talking about now, and like GraphQL Europe's literally happening at the same time as Fluent Conf, so I'm sure a lot of cool conversations will happen around that. But like a company like Apollo, we're actually Meteor is Apollo's project, or vice versa. Apollo is Meteor's project, and they do caching for you within like the Apollo 2. So Peggy had a talk about Apollo in general and what it does there. So that's what handles the caching, but everything is the same. So if you do caching on your backend already, every time you hit your GraphQL endpoint and you're hitting that API on the REST side into your gateway, like if you've hit it already, the caching exists. So all that's the same unless you want to pull it to a GraphQL side. And I think now those like rate limiting caching happening on the GraphQL gateway side are conversations and solutions that are happening now. But prior to that, everything you did with REST, exactly the same.
Nice. So it feels like in a lot of ways, this is part of the evolution towards more complex front ends.
Yeah.
And as we've tried to do more and more on the front end, we've then had to think more and more about data. And you have stuff coming like the Elm architecture and Flux, Redux, Vuex, all these different ways to do it. Is GraphQL a replacement for those? Does it play nicely with those? How is it?
Yeah, that's a conversation a lot of people, there's a lot of popular blog posts that get really popular but really don't have much substance to it, where it's like GraphQL is the replacement for REST. I don't believe that's the case. I think GraphQL is an enhancement to REST. And if you go the gateway route, like you have a REST API, you're still exposing stuff the same way. And if we zoom out a little bit more of like what's happening on the front end, like there's more infrastructure going to the front end. For example, like now we have things like Webpack that are this making everything magically happen on our front end. We're bundling down to like HTML and CSS and like the good old days. And like, I think as we're speaking, like Brendan Eich is going to be talking and speaking on the main stage. Like he's one of the grandfathers of the web, and they've been doing it like that for years. And now we're revisiting that by using things like Webpack, and now with like Redux, and then we're managing all our data on the front end. And we have I like the term like front end for your back end for your front end type of deal. So I think GraphQL is just enhancing that sort of our conversation, where now you no longer have to worry about like actions and reducers. Now you're just working about queries and mutations. And so it's just a different paradigm. But I think I could see GraphQL expanding into other front-end architectures and being more of like a thing that people are going to get more serious about in the next few years.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about that in terms of maturity.
Yeah.
You said a lot of the questions around caching and things like that are still getting figured out, but it also sounds like you've been using this stuff in production for a while.
Yeah.
How mature is the system? How mature is the ecosystem? Like, if people are thinking about getting in, are there any bears in those woods?
Yeah, so it came out of like public beta. So it's now it's public, no longer beta as of last year, GraphQL, in the fall of last year. So it would have been last GraphQL Summit that just happened in the San Francisco. So at that point, a lot of companies had started attaching themselves to the GraphQL space and announcing that they've been using GraphQL secretly on side projects. So as more and more people get into production, which it seems to be quite a few people, large companies people have heard of, like Airbnb being one of the recent ones announcing their GraphQL experimentations, and GitHub's been one of them since prior to the public beta. Like, we've been using it internally for a very long time, and now going forward, like, a lot of our API usage and for public API usage and new features are going to GraphQL only. So specific features mainly due to like problems that we have. I was explaining actually to another person at lunch about one of the common problems I have as a GitHub user, as an employee now and also as a previous user of the API, is that as soon as you start testing the API, you hit rate limit. It's like right away.
Yep.
It's like, oh crap, I didn't mean to hit that 100 times. So now I have to wait an hour to hit that rate limit. But now with GraphQL, you don't get that sort of like problem. Like, you can solve that problem a little easier by limiting rate limiting within like the schema that you're defining. So if you want repositories, we're going to give you 100 repositories, and you have to paginate after that point. So it's just built into the API at
Interesting.
that point.
Yeah, I remember trying to set something up where I was not using the built-in widget, but I was trying to show how many stars or something like that, and I was hitting the API, and any sort of public-facing website that has any amount of traffic hits the rate limit almost instantly.
Yeah.
So does this get you around that? You basically...
Yeah, we're working on some creative things. Like, I don't actually work on the GraphQL team at GitHub, but I'm following close enough. I'm actually fairly new to GitHub within the last 6 months, so I got in a great time, apparently.
Yeah.
And
that must have been a crazy ride.
yeah, it has been a crazy ride. It's been interesting week, I guess. I'm not sure when this podcast will come out, but we'll look back and read all the blog posts in years from now and be like, I was there. But as far as the GraphQL stuff, like, a lot of people are doing really interesting things. I think this is a year where people are starting to talk about the solutions and the problems that they have solved. So, like, part of my talk was like the fact that I couldn't use Mongo as part of my GraphQL schema in my Rails app, and that everything was built like pretty much cookie cutter Rails app. It works with GraphQL, but anything outside of that, it doesn't. But within the 6 months of me submitting, getting accepted, and doing my talk, like, Mongo works in like the cookie cutter Rails gem. So
Right.
I think a lot of other things. And Apollo recently came out their Apollo 2.0 earlier this year. Now caching is built in as part of the solution for that. Schema stitching is another thing I briefly mentioned in my talk. Now that's like a trivial solution that people like Prisma are solving, and they have really good guides and tutorials around that. And when I say schema stitching, it's literally taking two different schemas or APIs and merging them together, which I have a whole nother talk that I've given at GitHub Universe about taking the GitHub API and using your regular API and is merging the GitHub API as part of your API and backend from GraphQL. So it looks like everything's coming from the same source, but in reality, you can combine multiple sources in one endpoint.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
So, as you said, it's been a kind of a crazy week. Is it verboten to ask you about that? I mean, there's been a lot of discussion online. Is this the end of GitHub as an open thing versus, well, Microsoft has actually been a pretty good steward the last few years and all this. What's the vibe from inside the building? Yeah,
so I think you could really go to Nat Friedman, who's going to be our future CEO. Nothing's finalized at this point, but he had a really good post at, I think we have a short URL. It's like git.io/nat-hi. And he put on GitHub pages, started up a whole site. So Nat's a talented developer, led the Xamarin team.
Which I've heard only good things about,
Yes.
by the way. Xamarin, I've never used it because I'm not a .NET guy, but my friends who are in .NET, they swear by it.
Yeah, same here. I haven't touched .NET or know much about Xamarin, but everybody I came into contact in the last week who have been pinging me and texting me and telling me congratulations, only do nothing but rave about our new CEO. So internally, we're all very excited, and we're looking forward to how we can influence Microsoft, which Satya, it's a public announcement, but he's looking forward to seeing how GitHub can rub off on Microsoft rather than vice versa. So we're very excited about what we can do now that we have Microsoft as mother,
the corporate angel.
The corporate angel. Yeah. Mother Microsoft is what I've been saying.
Yeah. Another question that's sort of more GitHub related than GraphQL related.
Yeah.
And if you want to just stay on the tech side, just push back on me. But something that's been going around a little bit as a controversy is the value of a GitHub profile as a resume, and the ways in which, on the one hand, it is a relatively open way to demonstrate competence and skills and various other things. On the other hand, it unfairly biases towards those who have the time and free, basically free time to invest in that. Does GitHub have a stance on this? I
don't know if GitHub has a stance. I know a lot of Hubbers have tweeted publicly about their hiring practices, which is all the same within GitHub. Like when I was hired at GitHub, no one looked at my GitHub profile. So
that's a pretty powerful statement.
Yeah. So, and it's funny because as I was doing my second pair programming interview, I alluded to my GitHub profile, and the interviewer actually mentioned, I haven't seen your profile because we don't actually look at your profile. So we love people who have lots of contributions on GitHub and are using it actively and are a part of our open source community. It's a really great way to see like what other people are working on, other cool projects that maybe somebody I'm following on has contributed to. And maybe because I know them, I can reach out to them directly and be like, hey, I saw you work on X or Y. Can you give me a mentorship or help me into that project? So, but as far as a hiring practice, like GitHub is not going to be the next LinkedIn. Like LinkedIn will be the next LinkedIn, and GitHub will continue to be GitHub.
And they'll both be owned by Microsoft.
And exactly.
Yeah, I think GitHub is a great positive signal, but it's a terrible negative signal, right? If you've got somebody who has an amazing GitHub profile, they're probably going to be pretty good. If you've got somebody who doesn't, that doesn't tell you anything about them. Maybe they've just worked in the closed source world.
Yeah, and if I could do a shout out to one of my interns for the summer, she actually wrote a blog post about laser cutting contribution graphs onto wood. And it was like part of one of her first projects as an intern at GitHub, and helped her out with that. She got help with Katrina Owen and C. John Run as well, who are both Hubbers. And it's funny because I look back at, she printed my business card, they're business card shapes, and she printed them out. And I look at back in my last year, and I had 2 weeks off in August, and like that's a proud signal for me to see that like I had 2 weeks off of no GitHub contributions, and that I can say, okay, I had work-life balance because I spent 2 weeks in London just exploring. And I think Katrina actually had the same experience too, and she noticed like 2 years ago when she was kicking off exorcism, rather 3 or 4 years ago when she was kicking off exorcism, she had nothing but dark greens. But in the last year, she's got some pretty healthy days off. So it's a good testament to see like do people really truly like work-life balance. But with that being said, we don't look at GitHub profiles as GitHub. So if you want to work for us, check us out, and regardless of if you have a profile or not.
Another GitHub related question while I've got you. And I know you said you've only been there 6 months, and I'm asking you to represent the company in a lot of ways. But one of the things that has been getting a lot of discussion over the last year or so is the complicated relationship that open source has with money and ways of funding developers to work on open source. There are things, folks who are putting up Patreon accounts to try to fund their open source work. Yeah. There's now this company Open Collective that is trying to provide ways to fund a project as a whole rather than an individual. It has been highlighted in one of our recent podcasts that GitHub has not really done very much to support that type of thing. There's no ability to do, like, for example, a buy license button on an open source project or something like that. Is that something that you're aware of? Is there a corporate policy around that? Is that something we might see more of in the future, where GitHub might support open source developers in ways of funding their projects?
Yeah, there's not much I could speak on about like what GitHub's doing to solve the problem within our roadmap. But I do want to point to Nat Friedman, who recently had an AMA on Reddit, and the question was posed to him. And his response, he actually was either affiliated or started a company that actually paid for contributions outside or something. You have to go back to the post. There's a good summary of his AMA out there, but it's something that actually piqued his interest. And I know it's something that's piqued a lot of interest. And I know a lot of other companies are doing really good things. Like Open Collective is like very successful at the Webpack community, and they're doing great things. I think GitHub is really paying attention to a lot of those things, but I can't really speak on what our solution is. I think there's a lot of good solutions out there that people should really look into, and a lot of them that you have named.
Yeah. Now, both GitHub doesn't have to worry about direct monetization as much because there's lots of indirect ways that Microsoft can monetize off of what GitHub is doing. And anytime there's a big change, there's an opportunity for re-examining and changing. Well, as a developer advocate, I know there are lots of developers who would love you to advocate for ways to get money to open source.
Yeah, and I'm a developer advocate at GitHub, but I'm also helping with the GitHub developer program as well, which has been in existence for a little bit, but it's still getting its feet off the ground. It's been established way before even the Microsoft inkling of the conversation started. But if you want to be part of GitHub developer program and you're looking to get closer to GitHub and find out more information about new API releases, changes, the whole GraphQL thing, we do workshops that we funnel directly to the program. You can sign up at developer.github.com/program. And I would love to talk with you. I'm literally doing tons of interviews in the next week with current members and finding out what they're looking for and to get out of a program to this nature.
Anything else you want to touch on?
No, I'm BWO at Twitter, and I'm at FluentConf.
Awesome. Thanks, man.
This episode of JS Party is brought to you by Hired. One thing people hate doing is searching for a new job. It's so painful to search through open positions on every job board under the sun. The process to find a new job is such a mess. If only there was an easier way. Well, I'm here to tell you there is. Our friends at Hired have made it so companies send you offers with salary, benefits, and even equity up front. All you have to do is answer a few questions to showcase who you are and what type of job you're looking for. They work with more than 6,000 companies, from startups to large publicly traded companies, and 14 major tech hubs in North America and Europe. You get to see all of your interview requests. You can accept, reject, or make changes to their offer even before you talk with anyone. And here's the kicker. It's totally free. This isn't going to cost you anything. It's not like you have to go there and spend money to get this opportunity. And if you get a job through Hired, they're even going to give you a bonus. It's normally $300, but since you're a listener of JS Party, they're going to give you $600 instead. And even if you're not looking for a job, you can refer a friend, and Hired will send you a check for, get this, $1,337 when they accept the job. As you can see, Hired makes it too easy. Get started at hired.com/JS Party.
I am here talking with Aimee Knight, former professional ice skater turned full stack developer. Aimee, how are you doing?
Very good. How are you today?
Life is great.
Good. Same.
So you're speaking tomorrow morning.
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit about your talk?
Yep. So I am not super, deep diving into CSS anymore, but because I'm at a new job now. But I was at Warner Brothers for about 2 years, and I was doing front end there. So I'm back to like full stack now. But while I was at Warner Brothers, and I guess, the talk is a deep dive into CSS and like how the browser renders your style sheets. And the backstory on that is when I first started programming, JavaScript was the part that really scared me. And CSS, I was like, this is super easy. It's kind of, just change a color here and there. And JavaScript was the part that I was really scared of. But then somewhere, kind of like my progression as a developer, I felt really confident with my JavaScript and my ability to debug my JavaScript. And like, you give me a problem with JavaScript, eventually, I'm going to be able to figure out the solution. And I'm going to be able to reason about it and tell you, if it's not working, why it's not working. But as I got more advanced with CSS, I did not feel that way. I felt like I was just like blindly throwing darts at a dartboard half the time. And when I got to Warner Brothers, and like really amazing designers, and they hand you something and you have to implement it, I really felt like I couldn't call myself a front end developer because I could implement the logic all day for the JavaScript, but I was just felt scared sometimes when they'd hand me these designs. Like I was like, oh my God, I don't know how I'm going to be able to do this. And so long story short there, I also, with JavaScript, I'm kind of one of those proponents for understanding the language before you really like deep dive into the framework. And so I wanted to apply that same, reasoning to CSS. And so I figured, if I really want to be able to debug my CSS, I need to understand at a lower level what's happening. So I wanted to understand how the browser is actually like parsing my style sheets. So I started, going into that. And then I also wanted the talk to be a little bit more practical and, stuff that like common problems developers face. So that's the stuff I like dug into. So.
Awesome. I'm excited to have CSS on the stage at a conference like Fluent, because I feel like in our industry, it's often sort of devalued and pushed aside.
I mean, I was very much one of those developers. And when I got to Warner Brothers and, some of the people that I worked with, I gained so much respect for some of their designers because their CSS skills were amazing. And I wanted to be able to do that as well. And, I couldn't, just in my whole process too, learning, still JavaScript is my go-to, and I would much rather write JavaScript than CSS still to this day, which is why I'm back to doing full stack and not CSS. But, other stuff I talk about in the talk too, it's important to understand when to reach for CSS, when to reach for JavaScript, because the browsers are implemented in such a way that although you can do the same thing in JavaScript, you're going to get, a lot better performance if you use CSS to do certain things. So, that's another thing. Like it pays to understand how to do these things because it's the most efficient way to do them.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw at some point Sarah Drasner tweeted about the team that had re-implemented Position Absolute with 2,000 lines of JavaScript.
Yes.
Re-implemented a buggy version of Position Absolute.
Yep, exactly. Yep.
So yeah, it really helps to understand your tools. And I think CSS often ends up being undervalued because many people coming into development are used to thinking about things logically rather than visually.
Yep.
And it's a language that is really designed for the visual.
Yes.
Which has different constraints and different design choices.
Yeah, and I know for me, you have to think about CSS differently than you think about JavaScript. So when you're writing CSS, sometimes you do want things to be global, and you do want inheritance, and you do want like that. I mean, you want the cascade. With JavaScript, you usually want to try to isolate things.
Yeah.
So you have to think about it very differently.
Yeah, there are a few isolated cases having to do with team size and project size where completely isolating your CSS makes sense.
Yes.
Because you don't want, one person on this 100-person team to break something that someone else on this 100-person team implemented and what have you. But most people are not in that situation.
Yeah.
And visual consistency is important.
Yep.
And what the Cascade and this global vision can give you is that kind of visual consistency.
Yep. So I guess like another cool thing too is for people, and there's a lightning talk that I want to try to get to when we're done, and they're going to kind of go into more of something called Houdini. Have you heard of this? So I have like a slide or two about that. But that's another thing I think. CSS is getting like more and more attention now, and it's becoming like quote unquote a little more cool with stuff like that where you can go more low level and like play around with things. So I'm excited about that too. Yeah,
the idea of being able to polyfill CSS perfectly is super exciting.
Yeah, and like implement new things too. We have the ability to do that in JavaScript, but we haven't had the ability to do stuff like that with CSS. So
yeah, one can imagine a Babel-like project built on top of Houdini for CSS. This is how we're going to push this spec forward, and you implement it before the browsers do.
Exactly. Like we'll be able to give them feedback and say, what's valuable, what maybe isn't so valuable, and stuff like that.
Awesome. So you said now you're doing full stack. Yep. Is it all JavaScript?
It's not. So I lean more JavaScript, but so it's a banking application, but it's more like a startup. So I work for a place called Built Technologies, and the application, it's in the fintech space, which is finance. And so we integrate with banks, and what we do, if anybody has ever taken out a construction loan or renovation loan, the process for that is a lot. It's very different than if you just get a loan for like a mortgage on your house or something like that. So the construction process is like you don't get the money all up front. So they release funds based on inspection progress. And so, you get X amount of dollars. And banks in the past, like they're doing this all with like Excel spreadsheets and stuff like that. So they entered the space like 5 years ago and have like an automated way for people to do this. And I've worked at a couple startups here and there, and a lot of people like work for startups, and sometimes I will say, like, quote unquote, you like drink the Kool-Aid or you don't. And I've always been envious of developers who have drank the Kool-Aid where they're at, because I've been at various startups and I hadn't drank the Kool-Aid, but where I'm at now, I've definitely drank the Kool-Aid. So I am pretty passionate about what we're doing and excited about what we're doing. But to answer your question, so on the front end, we have a lot of like legacy JavaScript, jQuery, some like very old stuff called there's a framework called CanJS. And we're on a very old version of it, but we're writing new stuff in React. And then we have some stuff in Node on the back end too, and some stuff in Python. Honestly, I took the job because I really love my teammates. And I don't know, that makes all the difference in the world. And then two, it's actually been really interesting and, dare I say, fun to work in more legacy JavaScript like that. I make the joke it's kind of like playing the game Kerplunk, where you have to very carefully pull, the stick out so all the marbles don't fall all over the place, because the React code has tests, and we're starting to write end-to-end tests for like the legacy JavaScript, because we have like this one method, and I think I posted a picture of it or something on Twitter. The cyclomatic complexity is like 120. So
funsies.
Yeah. So all that to say, I've actually kind of enjoyed working in the code base, because you have like very interesting constraints there. If you need to go in there and mess with this, cyclomatic complexity method that's like 120, and you need to go in there. I'm a very precise person, and I enjoy that. And so you have to really like take your time when you're in there, understand what's going on, and you kind of have to be a little bit careful about what you're doing. And
if you look at the industry at large, right, like the sexy stuff is all the brand new projects using only the new framework and what have you. But how many code bases? I mean, the rate this stuff changes, right? The cutting edge changes every year or two. Nobody can rewrite their apps every year or two. And so the vast majority of our code is legacy code.
Yeah, I don't know. I really enjoy it. There's actually a startup or like a consultancy startup in, I'm not sure where they're based on. They're called like Corgi Bytes. And I listened to one of the developers there do a talk a while ago, and they do really legacy stuff. And like the process that he described seems a little bit like what we're going through, and it's been very interesting. I've kind of enjoyed it. So,
yeah. So I'm curious to poke a little more, because I do training where I work with teams to figure out how they connect from their legacy code base to the new hotness, whatever it happens to be. And sometimes that's as much as like, let's teach you how to refactor your massive single style sheet into Sass. And use a front-end build system for the first time and things like that. So when you got there, were they already using React for some pieces, or have you seen how that process has evolved?
They had some stuff already, but like very, very minimal. And as I've been there, we've been doing more. So the process that they went through, and this was like before I started, a little bit while I was there. So kind of the bridge that we're using is TypeScript. And so they hired a consultancy to convert everything over to TypeScript and start integrating. So we have, a portion of the application that's still like just plain old jQuery, a portion of it that's Can, and now the new stuff in React. And so TypeScript has kind of been the bridge to get us into more modern JavaScript, even in the legacy stuff. And then also, the hope there is without testing that at least we have like some IntelliSense now, and we can start writing interfaces and stuff so that it's a little bit easier if we need to go and clean stuff up. We know, maybe if something's not being used or, what needs to get passed to it and stuff like that. So that's been a bridge. And I've enjoyed, working in TypeScript. It's been pretty fun too. And it makes you, I think too, it's a good thing for people, you don't feel too far behind. You're working in a, older application. At least you're getting to write like some, newer JavaScript that way, even if you're using an older framework.
Mm-hmm. To go in a different direction.
Yep.
I am a little fascinated by your story of coming from being a professional athlete, essentially.
Yeah.
And I was looking at your website, like it wasn't that long ago. You went through a boot camp 2014, and now you're speaking at conferences, keynoting, speaking on podcasts, JS Jabber, all sorts of stuff. So one, sort of what has that process been like for you? And two, for other folks who are looking to get into the industry or just getting started, like what are your thoughts and recommendations?
So I almost get goosebumps about it because it is one of the best decisions I've ever made. And is absolutely, I know Tracy Lee is going to give a talk about this, and it has changed my life. In a lot of, in so many different ways and so many good ways. But to like the backstory on that for people who haven't heard. So I spent majority of my life as a competitive figure skater, and I went to college, but the plan was kind of just that I was going to coach the rest of my life. And my parents did not really push me too hard academically. And I thought, I probably will just coach, this was my life. I mean, I traveled around competing, and I made it really far. But so my junior year in college is when I kind of thought, I had been through so many injuries, and I just kind of wanted to do something very different than what I'd done all my life. But at that point, it was too late to change majors. Mm-hmm. So I finished out what I was doing, and I started working for an advertising agency. And so I ended up doing marketing type stuff. And that's how I landed, or, that's how I kind of got turned on into programming. There was a developer that I was working with, and the story really was that I was doing marketing / project management. So it was a very small agency. So, you wear a lot of hats. And we had our own site, which was written in an expression engine, and we had changed addresses, and the phone number had changed. And I got tired of asking the developers to go in and update it.
Right.
And I don't think it could. We couldn't actually change it just in the CMS portion. We actually had to change some stuff in the code. And so I went home one weekend. I thought, I'm so tired of asking this. I'm going to figure out how to do it myself. Yeah. And I did that, and I was hooked. So I had to make the changes on the live site, but I was absolutely hooked. And so a couple weeks of that, I started going back to school for a second bachelor's degree, but just not going fast enough based on, I started going to meetups and talking to other developers. And so the stuff that I was hearing at the meetups, they had no clue about in school. And so that's when I decided to do the boot camp route. So I went to 6-month one in Nashville, and I was one of the very first cohorts. So I was cohort 4. So I really got in at the right time, I think. And it has changed my life in so many ways, whether it be, able to, one of the most I will say a very empowering thing is to be, for anybody, not just a woman, but to be a woman and be able to support myself. And there's so much freedom in that. Yeah. I just bought a house, so awesome. being able being able to support myself in these kinds of ways, and is incredible and amazing. But that's almost, that's just kind of the small parts, and it has changed kind of the way I view the world. I love our community and all the different people in it, and it's changed the way I think about problems and think about the world. Because just the way I break things down, kind of question things and not always take things, at face value and really dig into them. Another part too is I skated for so many years, and I learned, in my 20s that my personality just kind of thrives on having something I'm passionate about. And so that was another thing. Like after skating, I knew marketing was like not cutting it. I needed something really to like dive into and, you know, something beyond just like a 9 to 5.
Yeah.
And so programming did that for me and still does. Like I love it. So
that's awesome.
It's like how many people, I just feel super blessed. Like how many people get to, you know, do something they love and they get, you know, paid to do it. It's their job. And yeah, it's awesome.
Absolutely. No, I think, you know, the tech industry and programming has certainly been very good for me in my life. And, you know, one of the reasons I'm now doing more teaching and training is I want to enable that because it is, you know, it's one of the few jobs that you can get right now where you can come in without a degree. You can self-teach or go through one of these boot camps or one thing that I've seen recently that I really love is this new thing, Lambda School, that Austin and Allred is doing, where they don't even charge you up front. They'll only charge you if you end up in a job making at least $50,000 a year. And then it's a percent based on your income. So it's guaranteed to be affordable. So you can come in, you don't have to go through a degree. You can self-teach or go through one of these boot camps. You can get yourself a solid upper middle class incomes, sometimes even better. You can do it from anywhere. I mean,
I am always very careful. People who want to get into it, like I'm very, very cautious of like making sure you get into it for the right reasons. Like I think you do have to, it's not, it's very much a career where you have to really, especially in like web, you have to you always have to keep up on what's going on. And somebody gave me the advice and take it for what it's worth, but I think there's a lot of truth to it. Like be very careful about like moving into the industry if it's not something that you would find yourself doing as a hobby too. Like you need to take a break and you don't want it to consume you, but it moves so fast that
I mean, I think
I'm very careful how I say that, but
exactly. Well, and you know, not everyone has the luxury to be doing that type of thing as a hobby.
Yes, that is very true too.
And I think it's, you know, I think we exclude a lot of people if we say you've got to be super passionate about it to do it. Like it is completely legitimate to do this as a job. But be aware that you're going to have to invest a lot of time keeping up and learning. And so, you know, you can do that because you're passionate about it, and that's awesome. You can do that because that's part of what you signed up for a job. You do need to be aware of it. That is something you get in this
maybe
industry.
It's like listening to podcasts on your drive in or on your commute in or something. But just those little things. Like you got to be aware that it's not
one and done. Like I did my studying and now I can work the rest of my life doing it. No, it's a constant effort of learning.
And if you're the kind of person that thrives on that, like I think it would be a great career.
Awesome. Anything else you want to highlight or talk to? I know you mentioned you're doing some stuff with podcasting, so we love podcasting.
So I listen to the Changelog, but if anybody wants to check out the JavaScript Jabber podcast, I do that too. Check out.
What kind of stuff do you cover? Besides, JavaScript, obviously.
All JavaScript. All kinds of stuff. I mean, we're obviously JavaScript podcast, so we try to focus on JavaScript, but we talk about sometimes like soft skill stuff, and we'll talk about just like tech in general, and So, or I will say this too. I have like my Twitter DMs are open because being somebody who entered into this field, I got so much help from so many people. I'm just like eternally grateful to them. And sometimes I think it can be very intimidating as a new person to go to like a forum or something like that. So it may take me a while to get back to people, but feel free to like shoot me an email or a Twitter DM or something like that. And I'll do whatever I can to like try to personally help you. It's not a scalable solution. So like I said, it takes me a while sometimes, but I've been an intimidated person before, and like sometimes that personal touch people need. So
that raises actually a really good question. Another conversation we were having is, so we now have a lot of these boot camps and things that are really good at getting people to entry level. But the growth path from entry level to mid, senior, tech lead, something like that is much fuzzier. And as I said, you seem to have been doing quite well at it. You're coming out and speaking at talks, you're keynoting places, you're on the podcast. What are your recommendations for folks who are maybe they've gotten into the industry, they've been there for a year or so, and they're trying to say like, how do I get to the next level?
Yeah, man, that's a hard thing. And I always like preface advice I give with, this is what worked for me. I don't know that it will necessarily work for you. There's a million different ways to go about things. But I've never been really focused on, mid, senior, stuff like that. I will find something that I'm excited about, and I will dive into that, and that's how I progress. I am very much the like junior dev for life mentality. And I think too, like we were talking about, you got to be careful not to burn yourself out. I'm in it for the long haul. And so I try to keep a like slow and steady wins the race mentality. So that would be my advice. Like slow and steady wins the race, stay excited, guard yourself so that you don't get burned out, so you can stay excited and you can keep progressing.
Hey everyone, I'm Tim Smith, senior producer here at Changelog. You know how important it is to stay in the know, and our weekly newsletter helps you and thousands of other developers do exactly that. It's the developer news that matters, nothing more and nothing less. Visit changelog.com and subscribe today.
I'm here with Bryan Hughes, technical evangelist from Microsoft, nebrious in all things online, Twitter, GitHub, etc., and longtime open source contributor primarily in JavaScript. Bryan, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. Thanks for having me on.
You bet. So you gave a talk this morning.
I did.
Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so it was a talk that was an introduction to TypeScript. TypeScript's something I've been using for about 2.5 years now. Not surprisingly, I started using it when I first started working at Microsoft. Before that, I worked at a series of startups, so I'd been doing JavaScript for a long time, but just not TypeScript. Although back in the day, before I graduated college, I was a C++ developer. So I started on C++. I came from that static typing world. And then, of course, moved to JavaScript. And there's a lot of things I really liked about JavaScript even early on. Well, once I actually got to know it, as opposed to just what I'd heard from other people kind of ragging on it. Once I actually got to know, I was like, there's a lot I really like about this.
Yeah.
But I missed static typing. That was always the one thing that I really didn't like. I felt like I had lost the safety net that I was just used to. And so I was just immediately drawn to TypeScript whenever it first came out. And when I moved to Microsoft and I had a chance to actually use it in production and see the best practices, proper ways of using it, not just little hello world and thing like that, I was like, this is really, really great. I love this. And so I've been talking about it in addition to using it. And so my talk today was titled TypeScript in Practice, and it was sort of an introduction to TypeScript the way I wish that I could have had it back then. In which, I talk about the language some. I don't go into a lot of detail, but I talk about it some. But more importantly, I talk about all the other things, all those other considerations and questions that we come up with whenever we think, should we use a language? Such as how do I incorporate external code? How do I use it in React with Webpack? And how do you get all those integration stuff? What are the best practices?
All the nitty gritty guts that go into not just doing a tutorial, but using this thing for real.
Yeah.
Nice.
Which I think it went well. I got a lot of good feedback on it. And it's a topic that I'm really passionate about. I really, really love TypeScript.
Yeah. One of the things I love about TypeScript, and I'm not really a big TypeScript user, but I love the way that in contrast to some other attempts to add typing to JavaScript, it is literally a superset of the JavaScript language. So you can drop JavaScript in and it just works. Makes it a lot easier to migrate and to just start using.
And I think that's really one of TypeScript's greatest powers, is that it is a superset, and that vanilla JavaScript is TypeScript. And I think that design decision came very early on, of course. And I think it was informed by a couple of historical events. No technology ever exists in a background or in a vacuum. And one of the things about TypeScript is it was one of the first compiled to JavaScript languages to become popular after CoffeeScript. And I think that's really important. CoffeeScript, it's easy to kind of criticize a lot of its design decisions. Now, I was personally never a big fan of it, but it was really important. And I think we should give it a lot of credit in that it sort of invented the whole compile to JavaScript phenomenon.
Yeah.
We wouldn't really have Babel the way it looks today without CoffeeScript because it pioneered it. But it did, of course, have a number of drawbacks. I think the biggest one of which you're kind of hinting at is that it was an all or nothing. If you wanted to use CoffeeScript, you had to rewrite your entire code base, and like that's just not very tenable. And I think that was one of the big complaints, especially once people actually started using it. And so we couple that with
the ternary operator. They didn't have a ternary operator, but it was still valid syntax. So you'd do it, you'd think it was going to work, and you'd spend an hour or 2 or 3 figuring out why the heck is my code. Not that I ever did this or anything.
Of course not. Of course not. But I do also seem to recall that it was technically an ambiguous grammar too, which is something you don't normally see in languages.
Problematic.
Yeah. So like the designers of TypeScript, definitely saw this context, but also I think coupled with the context of Microsoft in general and how we are now versus how we used to be. Microsoft has a very long and questionable history. Especially in the web world. And, we're very conscious of how we're perceived now. And I think there's a lot of effort from a lot of us to try and, I guess in a way, right the wrongs of the past. And so we're very conscious not just of the technology we create, but how it's going to be perceived and like what its role and place is going to be. So when we were looking at designing TypeScript, we're very conscious of, our own history with the web. And also with just paying a lot of attention in general to like how will users actually perceive this, technically, but also kind of socially. Given that people have a lot of feelings about CoffeeScript, and we wanted to avoid those comparisons, and we also wanted to avoid the comparisons of like, Microsoft just wants to bring C# to the web or something like that.
Right.
And TypeScript is not C#. Especially when you dig into it, it's very different than C#. And I actually see TypeScript trip up C# developers about as much as I see them trip up vanilla JavaScript developers, kind of like when both sets are just kind of starting to learn it.
Right.
But I do think it's a really great language, and kind of once you get over an initial learning curve, it really accelerates productivity. Which is perhaps sounding a little contradictory. Like most people think, static typing means I have all this overhead. There's so much more work I have to do now. And it may be a little bit true at first, but the analogy I always like to make is that's a lot like unit tests. In that unit tests are overhead, right? And, they are that. We can talk about it all sorts of different ways, but it is overhead at the beginning.
Right.
But once we get them in place, we save so much time down the road that it actually does save us time. It's really, we're not adding work, we're shifting work from the debugging phase more to the design phase. And I think TypeScript does the exact same thing. We do a little bit more work up front, but it saves us work down the road.
Well, and we're especially seeing the rise of typed languages for web development as more and more complexity moves to the front end and moves to things that are being developed in JavaScript or JavaScript-like languages, compiled to JavaScript languages, things like that. We're seeing that with that additional complexity, having some additional support can be pretty useful.
And I think VS Code's a really good example of this, in that TypeScript was, in a way, kind of also developed to really help out the VS Code team. Because that code base is actually a lot older than VS Code itself. It started off as an online editor called Monaco. I want to say it was maybe part of the Azure portal, but I don't actually quite remember, but I know it's part of our online property, and not actually, it wasn't originally developed to be like a desktop editor. It was when Electron came around, we're like, hey, wait, we've got this really good online editor. I think we could do things here, but there was so much more that had to be added, and they started, as the project kept growing, it was kind of becoming like unmanageable.
Right.
And so, brought TypeScript in, and now it's back to being a really manageable code base. And I want to say it's about 500,000 lines of code, something like that these days. It's not a small code base at all.
Right.
And I think once you get to that size, not using static typing is untenable.
Yeah. Well, I saw online, I don't know if this just came out as being public knowledge or not, but that the whole Office 365 suite of products is being rewritten in JavaScript using React Native for different devices and things like that. And I would assume when they say JavaScript, they probably mean TypeScript.
I would assume so as well. I have no inside information on that. A lot of things at Microsoft are a big company. I tend to learn on Twitter, the same as everyone else.
That's where I learned it.
Yeah, the same thing with the GitHub acquisition. So I have no inside information on this, but I would be pretty surprised if we didn't use TypeScript for it.
I want to go in another direction. I saw in your, I don't remember if it was your website or your bio, but that you've done some stuff in the IoT world. And I'm going to guess that was with JavaScript or TypeScript.
It's a longer story than that, but the answer is yes for the last several years. But I actually majored in electrical engineering in college, so I started doing hardware in like 2001 kind of thing. So well before the term IoT existed, and well before even like the Arduino existed, kind of thing. So I didn't start doing JavaScript on hardware. Whenever I graduated, though, I graduated with a PhD in 2010. PhDs take a while. 2010 was not a particularly great time to be entering the job market. We're still kind of in, right. There's this whole like recession thing that happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was actually pretty tough to find a job, especially since I didn't go to a top 10 school. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up working for a startup doing pure software. I was actually writing Java. But during that, we ended up having to do some JavaScript work as well. And like I actually remember this was a 8-person startup kind of thing. So we sat in the room because the entire company can fit in one room. We're like, so we need to do some stuff with this whole new HTML5 thing people are talking about. Anyone know JavaScript in the room? Anyone? All right, new guy, you get to do it. And so it was kind of how I got started. So I was very much thrust into the software world, or the pure software world, I should say.
And just to ask, your PhD was also in electrical engineering?
Yes, it was. Yeah. And I mean, I've been coding since the late 90s, so I'm like definitely not new to software.
Right.
But I didn't expect to go into pure software.
Right.
But I did for a while, but then I went to JSConf US in 2013, and that was a pretty transformative conference. Because there was a couple of key people from the Johnny 5 project, which, for those who aren't familiar, it's a Node.js robotics framework for Node.js. I guess that's totally a cyclical definition. Ignoring
JavaScript robotics.
JavaScript robotics, yeah.
Robotics in JavaScript.
Yeah, and this was like early days of the project too. I think the project was less than a year old at this point, but I was like, this is awesome. I was like, I did stuff in like a 4-hour workshop that would have taken me 2 weeks in assembly, which is what I did in college.
Right.
And so like that kind of drew me back in. And so I got involved as a collaborator on the Johnny 5 project. I maintained Raspberry Pi support for it, which the Raspberry Pi was the first platform supported that was not part of the initial set that Rick Waldron created too. So I guess that's kind of my biggest claim to, well, I don't know if it's my biggest claim to fame, but a claim to fame in any case.
You are the Johnny 5 Arduino supporter? Is that what you said?
Raspberry Pi.
Sorry, Raspberry Pi.
Yep.
Brain fart.
Yep. So if
I've been doing this for 2 days. I'm like, where's the brain? No, sorry.
Totally understandable.
So you are the Raspberry Pi Johnny 5 supporter to this day.
Yes.
And you did the original implementation as well.
I did.
Many people have to thank you.
Yeah, it's really cool to see like how many people have used the software that I wrote and all the cool stuff that they've created with it. It's just, there's so much creativity out there. So if you know Tomomi Yamura, just as one example, she used a Raspberry Pi and Johnny 5, so that's my software, and she created this like automated cat feeding system that had like cat facial detection and all this other like really awesome stuff. And I'm like, that's amazing.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And so it's really cool, like especially in the IoT world, like working on these kind of frameworks and how we can enable people to do so much cool stuff, and especially a lot of really cool art.
Yeah. So I'm kind of curious what you see happening in that direction, because I feel like IoT has gotten a lot of buzz and it's very accessible in a lot of ways now, right? You can get a Raspberry Pi. I don't know what the current going cost is, but it's $50, something small. You don't need to know anything but JavaScript because you can run in with Johnny 5 and just start making stuff. So where is this going to go next?
It's an interesting question, I think, because, we're definitely in a hype phase of IoT. It strikes me as a little different than hype that I've seen for other technologies in the past. Like I very much remember the HTML5 hype bubble, and that very much was a hype bubble. Cryptocurrency may be kind of a similar kind of hype bubble. I'm not going to comment one way or another. I don't know it deeply enough, and I know people have a lot of very strong opinions.
There are some strong opinions there.
Yeah. But there's this definitely kind of like a hype bubble. I don't really see the hype around IoT as a bubble, though. And that's because there's the underlying tech and the underlying market is actually very different than the others.
Yeah.
And that IoT, like as a market, people actually creating products is very old. It's like not a new thing at all. People have been doing it for decades, in fact. It's just like the way we do it, and more importantly, who is the ones doing it. That's what's changed. Is that now as hardware has become a lot more accessible, you don't have to be an electrical engineer to do it anymore.
Right.
I mean, electrical engineers have been doing this kind of work for so long. So like the market's already been proven with IoT.
Right.
Like we know that there's a market for this. It's just a matter of like making it easier to do and bringing in new developers so that we can create more products. It's not necessarily that we can do new things now. I mean, a little bit like the cloud helps with that. But I think that with IoT, it's basically old school hardware with new cloud things, which is, it's really the same thing that we're seeing in mobile and web and everything else. Like cloud is nothing new exactly. Like we've had servers for a long time. What it does though, and why it's powerful, is that it makes it easy.
Right.
It's
And
not
cheap.
new, but easy and cheap. Yeah. And so, it's that lowering the barrier to entry is just super important because that's where we start to get new ideas built on top of it. But I think IoT is the exact same thing. It's just making this thing that's existed for a long time easier. And yeah, I think the Raspberry Pi, Arduinos, and all that play a big role. But also things like Johnny 5 and the fact that you don't have to write this in C anymore or assembly even.
Right. You have a little bit of a web development background. Suddenly you can get started.
Yeah.
Start playing with it. I want to touch back to something related to kind of how you got into software, because one of the things I love about our field is that people can come into it from all sorts of different backgrounds. You don't need to go and study computer science for 4 years to get into software. So can you talk a little bit about your trajectory getting into the software industry? It sounds like you'd been coding for quite a while, but that wasn't what you studied. So how was it getting in? How was it getting going? And what's kept you around?
Oh, it's definitely been a trajectory. It's interesting how, like, reflecting on it now, I see how, like, market-driven I was in a lot of ways. So, like, back when I was in high school, I took AP Computer Science back then. So I had, like, formal computer science training early on. But I was like, well, okay, I really like this. I actually also thought about going to theater because I was really good at technical theater. But I didn't want to be a starving artist. Both my parents are musicians, so yeah, I kind of know.
I actually know a surprising number of musicians who code to make money to support their lifestyle as musicians.
Yeah, I know. Like, if I'd seen this, 15 years later, it might have been a different decision. But it was a little hard to get into coding back in the 90s, I think.
Yeah.
But the other thing was, so I graduated in the summer of 2001 from high school, which means I started looking at colleges at the fall of 2000, spring of 2001. And I'm interested in coding, like I really liked coding.
But that was the death of the bubble. What are we going to do? Nobody's going to study computer science. You'll never be able to get a job.
Exactly. I was like, is this even going to be an industry in 5 years? Like, I had no idea. So I was like, that would be the worst idea ever to go into computer science in 2001. So I was like, well, I really like my physics class, and we kind of went over some basics of electrical engineering. And that was also like theater, but I decided, no, I wanted a more stable career, so electrical engineering was it.
Nice. And then going along, 2010, yet another recession.
Yeah.
Man, you've had the best timing.
Oh, I know, right?
And you ended up at a startup?
I did. I actually had two competing offers at the time. One was from Intel, and the other was the startup that I actually ended up working at. And I decided to try the startup thing, just I was kind of interested in it. And so this startup, it was called Particle Code, something that I think no one ever knows. We had a beta product when we were acquired type thing.
Right.
But it was a really cool product. So what this was it was a 2D isomorphic gaming engine, cross-platform. So think Unity, but for 2D isomorphic, and specifically on mobile. And mobile in 2010 was a very different world. You know, Android and iPhone were the big up-and-comers, so we supported them. And that was like one of our big things, is like, hey, you can get onto these new things where there's not much support. But you can also support, BlackBerry and Symbian and kind of what at the time was your base market. And the way we did this was you would write it in Java. It was, a subset of Java. We supported the whole language, but not the whole JDK.
Right.
And then we had our own SDK as well. So you would write to that in Java, and then we'd cross-compile it to whatever language the platform was on. So, Java to Java in a couple of cases, but also to Objective-C, C++. And then eventually we were like, mobile HTML5 as well.
Yeah, one of the things I love about startups in particular as a way to get into the industry is if you're in a startup, there are no barriers. If you're willing to do it, go do it, because there's always more to be done than there are people to do it. So I kind of got into the industry in the same way. I studied physics in college, got out and said, I don't know what the heck I want to do, but it sure isn't physics. Ended up at a startup, and I was doing basically testing, but they had software. And I was able to first write test harnesses and then start mucking around because it's a startup. Anything you're willing to volunteer and sign up to do, you can learn to do and go do it.
And no one's going to complain, because that's like less work for everyone else to do. And everyone has so much work at startups. It's kind of the cool thing. That's another thing I love about it is we end up doing all these like different things.
Yeah.
And we really kind of like stretch ourselves a lot. You know, we're not just like, oh, I am the Node.js API person. I don't do database stuff. I don't do, like, that's not an option.
Yeah.
So it really kind of pushes us to learn because we have to, because if we don't do that, the startup goes under.
Absolutely. It's a great way to break into the industry.
And I think a very valuable lesson too. And I think there's a lot of valuable lessons to be learned at big companies as well, but they're a different set, to be sure.
So for anyone looking to get started in, let's pick either IoT, robotics, or TypeScript, where do you recommend they start out?
So for on the IoT side, definitely Johnny 5. You can go to Johnny-5, all letters, .io. And there's like the API docs and all that, but we're really good about documentation for that project. Like documentation has always been a really big goal of ours. Because I guess especially when we were starting out, we were targeting beginners, people very, very new to hardware, possibly even new to coding in general.
Right.
And so we put a lot of effort into our documentation. So there's a lot of like examples there. There's documentation about all the boards, some tutorials and guides and everything else. So like that's a really good place to start.
Are there online simulators? So if I don't have a board, I can still start playing with it?
That one's a little trickier. You can do it in Johnny 5 if you know how to muck around, essentially reusing our test harness, but it's not particularly interesting. So I would say the best thing to do is to go get an Arduino. And they actually do make some pretty affordable kits where you get like an Arduino plus a couple of sensors for maybe like $50.
Awesome.
And also I just recommend it especially for hardware because like the cool thing about hardware is that it's tangible.
Yeah.
It's like there's a physical thing. You can touch it and feel it. And like, getting an LED to light up, which getting an LED to light up is the hello world of hardware, but it's so much cooler than seeing some text in a console. Like it makes the typical software hello world like so boring.
You'll never go back.
You never go back. Yeah. So I definitely recommend getting hardware just because there's this like tangible factor to it that makes it real. And then as far as TypeScript, TypeScriptLang.org is the main website. It's got a lot of pretty good information. Also, some of the key folks working on it, whose name is escaping me all of a sudden, but has a blog. Daniel's his name. I can't remember his last name, but he has a blog and he does a lot of like talking about it a little more in depth as well. So that can be a good location. And I think there's some books out there as well. I actually don't learn well from books, so I don't really keep track of what the current books are. But I think there are some like O'Reilly books out there.
All right, thank you for tuning in to JS Party this week. Tune in live on Thursdays at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern at changelog.com/live. Join the community and Slack with us in real time during the shows. Head to changelog.com/community. And do us a favor, share this show with a friend, rate us on Apple Podcast, go into Overcast and favorite it. And thank you to Fastly, our bandwidth partner. Head to fastly.com to learn more. And we move fast and fix things around here at Changelog because of Rollbar. Check them out at rollbar.com. We're hosted on Linode Cloud servers. Head to linode.com/changelog. Check them out and support this show. Our music is produced by Breakmaster Cylinder. And you can find more shows just like this at changelog.com. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.